All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the session. And for those who haven't been to an earlier session of mine, it's going to be pretty jam-packed. So I'm thinking you guys have had a pretty long week. It's been pretty exhausting. And you've probably had a pretty long night last night. So we're going to try and make every one of those brain cells that you do have left in use in this session. All right. So my name is Richard Harbridge. I work for a company called Portal Solutions. We work in this area. It's a pretty big area. And we're based out of Boston and DC. Now, one of the things that I just want to highlight, everyone here has probably seen the keynote. You've probably been around to many other sessions. And so you probably understand that there's this amazing thing called the SharePoint community. And for those who haven't been or had a chance to go to a user group or to a SharePoint Saturday, I highly, highly recommend you do that. And in fact, it's really important that you talk to each other. And obviously, over these last couple days, you've had lots of opportunity to network with one another. But make sure that you're doing follow-up after the conference as well. You know, set up a time to have a little conversation and say, you know, what did you learn, or what did you see, or what are you doing? And actually share maybe some of your, you know, your intranets with each other and show, you know, what's working for you, what's not, and really create your own little community of people that you can rely on and trust. And one last point on this, there are a large number of user groups. There's actually more than were illustrated in the keynote. So if you haven't been to a user group lately, take a look, because there might be a user group that's more business-focused than necessarily technology-focused in your area. This is a new trend where there's actually some user groups that are actually business user groups for SharePoint, where there's business discussions and things like that versus the sort of typical technical ones. All right, that's probably enough on that. I did finish a book recently, so feel free to grab that from the store if the store is still open. If not, feel free to email me and implore me to send you free ebooks, and sometimes I cave and I give them, so please follow up on that. One last question or key note for you guys. If you have questions beyond today's conference, every single speaker, at least the ones that I'm aware of, and pretty much everyone in the community is very, very, very nice when you email them. If there's a question you have, they'll figure out a way to answer it. And so to the same degree, if you have technical questions that we're not going to get into today, because this is a non-technical discussion, then please send those to me. And if I can't answer them, I'll forward them to many colleagues that are much smarter than myself. All right. So our goal today is to talk about these non-technical factors of SharePoint. Right? How do we deal with this stuff that's not technical, right? Technical is really easy because it's sort of science, right? This is what happens, this is how we react to it and solve for it. When it's social, right, when we have social problems, it's social science, right? And so it becomes very challenging in our organizations to determine the right way to do business analysis or the right way to approach sort of the strategy and other aspects of SharePoint. So today's goal is really to create more confidence and clarity on how to deal with some of these challenges. Now, we're not going to be able to cover them all because, as you can imagine, there's an infinite number of business challenges. But we can certainly cover some of the main ones. So it's going to be a very intense session. Just to give you a warning around how intense it is, to get from here to here, we're going to go through about 150 slides or 145 slides. Yes, right? Death by PowerPoint. So lots of information. Please be aware this is recorded. The slide decks will be available. I'll also put it on SlideShare as soon as I get some good internet connectivity. So you'll have lots of access to these slides. A lot of them have notes and other things. And of course, again, send me emails if you have more questions. You guys ready? Yeah. All right. Let's go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is step one in our 7-step process. And step one is really identifying, there we go, identifying the right technology decisions to make and how to make those decisions. So we're going to focus on this idea of making the right technology decisions. And it's going to be a little bit easier. If you've seen Bob in certain sessions, we also have Joe. So Joe is Bob's brother, and Joe's going to help us through this session. Now, the first thing Joe's going to do for us is he's going to explain that he works at his company, and at Joe's company, they have a bunch of problems, and we've all experienced these problems, right? Decision makers don't have enough information, the CFO needs to reduce costs, IT services is struggling to keep up, right? So these are very common problems, right? People have trouble finding what they need. So what does Joe decide? Well, Joe has this great idea. He works in technology, we all work in technology, so how do we solve our problems? With technology. It better be with technology, otherwise we're probably not in the right field, right? So we want to solve our problems with technology, but that's not easy. Well, in this case, Joe feels that it's really easy. In fact, because Microsoft is awesome and everything else is not as awesome, right? I mean, makes sense. And, you know, everyone in Joe's company uses Microsoft Office. SharePoint's the perfect fit. Done, right? That's it. 7 steps are done, right? Well, this, of course, is not true. So there's this challenge, right? The reality is I'm a business analyst by trade. That's where I've spent most of my time and energy. So I think everyone in this room understands that you need to understand the needs of your business, and you need to map the technology to it. So I'm not going to regale you with, hey, it's, BA 101, business analysis is important and we need to understand the needs of the business. Instead, I'm going to talk about why this is such a big pain point with SharePoint. Now, the first thing to understand is that Microsoft typically does not compete with itself, right? So when Microsoft releases another product, another service offering, or another server, that server product has specific goals, right? It does certain things. And so if you understand that Microsoft stack and that Microsoft ecosystem, you're going to avoid the problem of saying SharePoint is the right fit when actually maybe it was CRM that was the right fit. Or maybe it's Dynamics ERP that's the right fit. Or maybe it's some other aspect like Project Server and the portfolio management and other capabilities of Project Server instead of building all that using SharePoint. Make sense? Okay, so this is a big challenge. And it's actually really tricky because SharePoint is sort of seen as the silver bullet a lot of the times, and it's not, right? We know this. Most of us, I think, in this room can totally agree on this, that many, many times SharePoint's not the right answer. So you have to define what is that dotted line where you say, at this point, using SharePoint for maybe a CRM is the earlier example I gave in a different session, or even simple things like a lot of times people talk about scheduling, right? So we want to do scheduling, we want to share calendars and things like that. Exchange is a very powerful platform. There's a lot of capabilities for things like that. So you have to know at even a tactical level when to use the right technology versus the other one. And the secret to this is the clearer your business need is, right? The clearer those requirements are, the easier it is to map to the right technology. All right, so we get that. Let's move on. The second problem with SharePoint, there's more than two, but the second problem with SharePoint is that it has a lot of options. So we've all heard about the cloud, right? We know that there's on-prem, and we know that there's the cloud. And there's a big difference right now with on-prem and the cloud. And even in February timeframe or when, Office 365 has SharePoint 2013, there's still going to be a significant difference. Why? Because we have site collection boundaries and challenges that don't exist at the same level of complexity on-prem, right? The reality is there's no content by search web part. So it's very difficult to do roll-ups across site collections and other things. And even from deployment, right? It's really hard to build out a large site structure in Office 365 because we don't have the tooling. We don't have the same capabilities that we'd have on-premise, right? We can't build those farm-level solutions that say, hey, build all these sites for me and things like that. And so on and so on forth, right? So there's differences. Now, these sometimes are limitations, sometimes they're benefits. There are certain capabilities that exist in Office 365 that will not exist on-prem initially, right? And so we have to figure out, what is the right solution. But even if we move beyond that, we also have the trouble of different versions, right? 2010 is very different from 2013. You guys have seen tons of 2013 content in the last while, right? So we've all got an idea there's a huge number of additional capabilities, workloads, right? Social is a very different workload now versus when it was a couple years ago, right? Different foundational capabilities. E-discovery as an example, and records management in terms of getting some benefits. So there's a lot of specific scenarios where if we looked at just 2010 or 2007, right, or those versions, we might say, SharePoint's not the right fit. But now when we have these new capabilities, if that farm or that capability is inside your organization or you're deploying it soon, then you can start to map some of those needs. Well, then there's one more big challenge. There's more obviously beyond this, but one of the other big challenges is the versions, right? There's a huge difference in some cases by what's available to you in Foundation versus Enterprise, right? And so you have to understand the versions and the editions, right? So sorry, let's keep the clarity. So versions would be the 2003, 2010. We'll call it editions. So the different editions of SharePoint have different capabilities. So this is a hard problem, right? Not only do we need to know the Microsoft ecosystem, but now we have to understand all these different nuances for SharePoint if we want to be successful. And many organizations have multiple versions, right, or editions. Some organizations have sort of a Foundation farm, and then they have, in large organizations, and they have the Enterprise farm. Or maybe you start with Foundation, but you're determining, does it make sense to move forward with moving the Standard or Enterprise, or whatever it happens to be. So there's a lot of consideration here. Now, another problem is that SharePoint doesn't do everything out of the box that you might want it to do. There are capability gaps in all the products, in each version, right? But there's a wonderful ecosystem of partners that support this, right? So a lot of them are in the vendor hall. So depending on what your challenge is, and I'm not saying that it doesn't have those capabilities, SharePoint is extremely feature complete, which means that it has an enormous number of features. The problem is, if we were thinking of them in as like a radial, right, and how much completeness, maybe they've only got like 25% of what you really want in terms of the full capabilities. You know, a great example, I might want to do knowledge management, or I might want to do idea innovation. There might be some basic templates out of the box, but they're not really going to get me there, right? I need to do things with that. Now, a lot of times, this ecosystem is really important to understand. There are over 350 vendors that I've listed on my own that I've found in SharePoint space. That number has gone up 100 in the last time I did it, which was 6 months ago. And I guarantee you, so I have over 2,600 products, each individual like little web parts and things like that. These are products that I've identified in SharePoint. It's a huge number, and that's gone out of the water. As soon as we start to get apps in there, right, it's impossible to keep track of all this. So the more in touch you are with that, the more you stop for a moment before you say, is SharePoint the right fit, or maybe it's SharePoint Plus is the right fit, right? Plus friends, plus these wonderful ecosystem providers. All right. Well, here's the gist of it, right? We understand that this technology piece is confusing on its own because of those 3 examples I gave. But sometimes the problem is the need maps to a process, or the need maps to a change in process that needs to happen. It has nothing to do with technology, to be quite honest. Now, technology can be a catalyst to help support that change, but the reality is sometimes it really isn't a technology issue. And so you also need to understand not only can we help solve problems with technology, but when to apply technology solutions versus other solutions like people and process solutions. Make sense? Awesome. All right, let's move on. Joe does all this good research in a perfect world, right? He does all this analysis, maybe he does some competitive analysis against different products. He determines that SharePoint is the right fit for these specific needs, and we're going to map it. And then from there, he decides that SharePoint's part of this overall enterprise technology plan. And this is important because he's saying it's going to work with these added products. It's going to work with these server products and other things, and maybe even client-based tools that users are using. All right, so this is a really important concept. All right, summarize, all I'm really saying is, 101, right? We need to map the needs of the business to the technology, but it is challenging with SharePoint. And we should recognize that the more understanding we have of that ecosystem and the more understanding we have of those differences, and sometimes subtle differences between those additions, the better we're going to be off. And that's why these types of conferences are great, right? All right. Now, the second thing here is, just as a cautionary statement, defining those needs carefully is really important. And I said this earlier, but specific is my favorite term when we start talking about needs. Too often they're abstracted, they're platitudes and other things. We need to get specific. So again, be specific and you'll be successful. All right. So that's step 1. Pretty straightforward. I think most of us are on the same page on that. Let's start talking about step 2. And for this one, I want a little bit of interaction from you guys. Now I'm going to pick on people in the front row because I know that they're going to respond to me. All right. So maybe a little bit too much. So achieving buy-in and setting expectations is really important. So we're going to do an exercise, and the exercise is that we're all going to look at this for a moment, and we're going to basically say what we see. So Rob, what do you see when you look at this picture?
I see a head.
So Rob sees a head. Who sees something besides a head? Somewhere nearby so I can hear you. Yep. So someone sees a landmass. Who sees something besides a head and a landmass? Show of hands, right? Lots of us. So lots of people give other implications and other considerations. Well, the reality is, technically, scientifically and also psychologically, this is a cow. So the picture, it might be easier to see when it's smaller. It's actually a cow. And your answers do tell me things about your psychological state and other things. But we're not going to get into that right now. The gist is that people see different things. Well, what does this have to do with SharePoint, right? Well, it's really important to understand that, 1, people are motivated very differently. Right? And that makes sense. Different roles, different responsibilities, and even individualistic, right? People are different. And if I take a word like attractiveness, we all have different interpretations of what that word means. Let's take another word. If I take the word SharePoint, we all have different interpretations of what that means. And in our businesses, everyone has a different interpretation. So what's the number 1 rule of SharePoint? Well, there's like 16 different rules, so I like that. No, one of the rules then is that we want to not call SharePoint, right? When you're interacting and we're trying to get buy-in and we're trying to get adoption, because yes, they could be a champion and they might love it, but they might also have very different opinions and experiences of what SharePoint is. I've had someone go at length and tell me that SharePoint was a browser. a web-based browser. I've had people tell me a lot of crazy things, and I've had people say very negative things about SharePoint. So the reality is, whether you think of SharePoint as that puppy, you bring it home, and it seems really nice, and then it makes a mess of everything, and it's hard to take care of, or you see SharePoint as, this server platform and opportunity and, this wonderful landscape, the reality is it's better to use terms that we all can agree on, intranet or whatever the branded name of our solutions or workloads are, right? And that's what we want to do. So, okay, so that makes sense. Let's move on. So this is my perception and my perspective, right? So I'm not saying that this is going to work for you, and I'm not saying that this is the most important thing for you, but in my experience working with hundreds of organizations and wonderfully getting feedback from lots of my peers, what I've found and what we found is that these two groups are extremely key. And you need to get them both on board. Now, you might think that IT services is completely on board. The key here is they need to buy in with the right expectations. And there's a difference between, hey, yeah, we're using SharePoint and we're supporting it, to really understanding what value it's providing to IT. So we'll talk about that. What's the most important thing to IT services? Feel free to shout it out. You guys work in IT, right? Stakeholders, cost, right? We want to reduce costs, providing more value. What was that? Yeah? So lots of different ideas, right? So there's a lot of different terms that we can use here. I'm going to use a single term called cost of ownership. You can agree or disagree. But if we think of cost of ownership as being really important, right, for IT, then how can we convince them? And more importantly, what do we want to focus on when we talk about the value of SharePoint? I'll tell you what. The secret is, and this is a really, really critical point, the main point of implementing SharePoint is that it eventually allows business users to implement technology solutions without IT's direct involvement. In other words, it's very similar to dreaded access, right? We've all dealt with the access challenges and, that's a beautiful access application, right? So we've all seen those types of things. And the Excel, right? Those Excel, you've built, what did you build in Excel? A series of databases, basically? That's crazy. So we've all been there, but the reality is these tools are meant, really the Microsoft stack in a lot of ways, at least these core Office type tools, they're meant to enable business solutions without needing to have that technical expertise, without really needing all of the, the IT to be behind it. Now, I'm not saying there aren't technology solutions. I'm not saying we don't scale some of these, right? We have a business solution that starts off, and then at some point they come to you, and instead of going, oh, God, what is that? You say, that's great. How can we make this better, right? How can we scale it? How do we, roll it out to more people and so on and so forth? But that key concept is important, because if you don't understand this as IT, what happens? Cost of ownership increases drastically. As value increases of SharePoint, cost of ownership increases on that same line. And the reason for that is IT takes ownership of all these projects. They take ownership of all these solutions. And when IT drives and runs these solutions, two things happen. One, it creates a lot of friction, right? Because IT has very different requirements. They have very different things that they need to accomplish. Two, it can be very prohibitive, because in many times, IT doesn't have the staffing and capability to execute these things. So you really need to leverage that. All right. So there is times where IT gets benefit out of SharePoint, and that's the second key point, right? The first one is business solutions get created. Then the second point is technology solutions, right? Those driven and run by IT get also created. And the key point with this is SharePoint has great extensibility. I mean, if anyone here is a developer, you understand what I'm saying. If you've worked with SharePoint for a period of time, it's a phenomenal tool for development. It's a great platform. And its integration capabilities are great. And it's not just SharePoint's integration. It's not just BCS and things like that. It's the fact that other tool sets have built integration with SharePoint. Right? A lot of investment is put into other technologies. So yes, it integrates with Office, but it integrates with all these other things very well as well. So there's a lot of value to IT in saying, you know what, we're going to build our technology solutions on SharePoint when appropriate, right? Rather than other technology tools, because these are the benefits. Does that make sense? All right, let's talk about why this is another big problem. So IT services, they struggle with keeping up, right? We have way too many technologies. The last time I've asked someone in IT, do you work too little? It's never been, a positive answer. So what we want to do then is we want to talk about this concept of information overload. And I recognize if you can't see these, that's okay. I'll just talk through it. So what we basically have is we have a bunch of systems, right? We have systems that help us work with information. And historically, the way we would deal with these things, as information grows, we would start to find problems with these systems, right? One of the problems might be that control and access is becoming an issue, right? And so what we do is we work on that system, right? We work on improving it. We upgrade it. We do all sorts of other things like that. And as we focus down on control, information continues to grow. And as information continues to grow, eventually what happens is because we're switching from system to system of focus, it's really, really difficult for us to keep up, right? The demand's always increasing. It's very, very challenging. This makes sense, right? This is basically the problem that we have in IT. And you could say instead of information, it could be expectations and services and other aspects. But in general, this is the rule, right? So Microsoft understands this model, right? Microsoft has worked with this model for a long time. And they said, you know what? This is kind of dumb. Let's get rid of it. And instead of doing this model, they do a model of interconnected services, right? Since at least 2010, it was actually a core architecture piece, right? The idea that if I make a change to permissions on a document, what happens in search? Right? It has an impact on search. So if I say, Rob, you cannot access this document anymore, and you do a search, you're not going to see it. So it's really important to understand there's this idea of interconnectedness. And it is important because when we make a change in SharePoint, when we build some capability, when we add a solution to it, we're actually leveraging not one piece of the pie or the wheel, if you think of the old model, or one cube, if we're thinking of the new one. What we're really doing is we're thinking of how it impacts all of these different things. And this means to IT, if you improve SharePoint or you come up with a solution, odds are it's going to benefit all across the board. Right? You don't have to think about permissions and other things. You don't have to think about search. You don't have to necessarily think in the new versions about cross-browser compatibility and other things as long as you're being respectful of it. Right? So lots of benefits. All right. What about decision makers? By the way, this is exactly what a decision maker looks like. All right. So what's the most important thing? Lots of determinations on this. Add value to the business, help with decision making, blah, blah, blah. All right. So let's move on. This is why decision making and helping decision makers is a challenge. The problem is the value that SharePoint brings is hard to explain, right? It helps achieve business objectives. I think we can all agree if SharePoint's not helping achieve business objectives, something's wrong in your organization. In fact, if it's having the opposite effect, then it's probably not the right platform for you, or there's something else very significantly wrong. But the problem is we talk about these things in productivity and reducing waste, and we use these terms that are very hard to put numbers and values to. We'll talk about ROI in the next section. But in general, and I did do this in the earlier presentation, but in general, it's really important to have specific objectives. So I'll go through a very brief example of that. And the second point, and I want you to remember this because I'm going to quiz you on it in a second, is that it takes time to achieve these objectives, right? Okay, so platitudes, these are terrible objectives, right? I want to enhance collaboration. I want to reduce redundancy. Those are very confusing. They have lots of abstract meanings. People interpret them different ways, so on and so forth. So we want to be specific. So let's dig into that for a second. And if we were to dig into one of those, like automating business processes, we'll do a slightly different example. So the other day I did a legal one. So now instead we go, well, we want to automate and improve paper-based processes. We want to automate and improve the HR paper-based processes. In fact, it's the ones that relate to onboarding and so on and so forth that we really want to do. Now, at this level, once we start to get to this level of depth, right, once we start to break down objectives to this level, it's much harder to start to determine success criteria. It's much easier to determine success criteria. It's also much easier to start thinking of the solutions. You know, up here, when I said automate and improve business processes, all we could really come up with was, I don't know, like workflow. We can kind of use SharePoint. It's going to help, right? But when we get to this level, we can start to imagine solutions, there we go, solutions that will help with this. Right? So we can imagine, well, we do an onboarding workflow, and maybe that has a whole lot of pieces. Maybe it's multiple workflows. Maybe it interacts with multiple business groups. And for those who aren't aware of onboarding, that's like when you get hired in the process of you getting, and most of the people, if you have had bad experiences with onboarding, you understand where it can be a big challenge. So onboarding, you know, they might have electronic forms. Those could be InfoPath. They could be web-based browser forms. It could be lots of things. Then we have integration with HRS. Why? Well, because we want to make sure that those forms are auto-populated with a bunch of data and so on and so forth, right? So we come up with these solutions. And when we come up with these solutions, because we're all great business people, we come up with wonderful ways of building these solutions, right? We come up with functional specs. We do process maps. We do requirements gathering. We do all this great stuff. But here's the problem. At this point, when you come back to the business and say, requirement X362 is going to help us, it's really hard for them to understand how is that really helping with improving, you know, our onboarding. Because as an HR person, I don't really care about requirement 3X blah, blah, blah. I don't understand how it implicates, or maybe I'm not HR, maybe it's a different business unit and you're just trying to get funding from them. So there's a trick that I found works well. And I'm going to show a really brief one. Now, there's lots that I could show, but I only have time for one. So one of the key points is you need to visualize in times how things relate. So earlier, we said we had objectives. So here's some objectives. These are terrible objectives, by the way, but they're at least better than what we had before. So we have some objectives. Those are on the top. And then on the left, we have our solutions, right? So you've seen some of these solutions, right? Workflow, these types of things. And then what we do is we say, is this having a direct benefit, right? A positive benefit on achieving this objective? And believe it or not, just with this very simple type of visualization, you can get a huge amount of communication across in that, hey, you know what? I can't do this one. I can't do onboarding forms because I don't have the resources. And so if you want this, I need help from you. And this is why it's value to you. And I understand this breaks down very quickly when you start to think of specific things, but it's important to try and figure out how do we visualize this a bit better. And even when you think about this, if you're trying to prioritize this, and you say automating and improving HR onboarding was our most important priority, it makes it pretty easy to start to prioritize which ones of these solutions we should start with. And this is a different approach, right? We're saying business value, and the correlation of the value is how we're prioritizing some of these things. All right, I'll come back to that. What's the expectation we have to set? Sorry, I won't. Thank you. That's the first person in like 60 of these that I've done that said that. So it takes time, right? Now I'm going to take you through a very quick demo of how this kind of works, right? In typical intranets and portals, it kind of works through a flow. And it's not always this case, but most of the time, they kind of start off as information-driven portals. They kind of move to collaboration-driven portals, business process-driven portals, and then finally we get to these sort of business intelligence-rich portals, right? And what do we want? What does every single executive and decision maker want? They want the far right, right? We want to start on the far right. Don't start on the far right if you can help it. Now, I'm going to break this down into a simpler scenario. So I was talking about portals. That's a pretty big topic, right? All of our implementation. Even if you're thinking of a specific solution, it should fall left to right if you can. And I'll take an example. So in our organization, Joe creates news articles. And it's a really basic process. He goes into Word, he writes up the news article, and what he does is he publishes it into SharePoint by uploading it to a document library. That's it. Nothing fancy. This is like Intranet 101, right? So he takes the Word document, he uploads it. Now what is he doing? He's doing the far left. He's doing information-driven, right? He's communicating it through SharePoint. So that's beneficial. There's still benefit there. So the next step is that Joe sometimes builds these articles with help. So sometimes I work with Joe on these articles. And Joe says, all right, let's work on this together. You know what? Instead of doing this email back and forth with these files, let's put it in that document library. And then when we're done, we'll publish it. And there's lots of ways to do that. In this case, we're going to make it really simple. We'll drag it to another library that's public. And we have sort of a private library where we're collaborating on it. Now, what's the benefit here? We're getting alerts, right? We're getting version history. We get all these benefits of collaboration in SharePoint. But the key is we've started with information. Now we're doing collaboration, right? So it's a lot easier for us to start with these features. And it makes sense to us. Does everyone know what SneakerNet is? Right? SneakerNet is where basically you go to your boss, you say, I have this form, I really need you to approve it. Or in this case, I have this new news article. So Joe and I run over to our boss, we say, we really need you to approve this because if you don't approve it, it's going to be useless in like a week because it's, it's for this week and it's all time sensitive. And the boss says, yeah, no problem. And you're like, it's really important. They're like, yeah, just put it in that box over there and put it in the box. And then a month later, you hear that he finally gets approval on it, and you're like, that's not helpful, right? So this is SneakerNet. So what do? We decide, you know what we're going to do? Since notification seems to be a trouble, and reminding and visibility is an issue, we're going to make a workflow, or we're going to use the native approval process in SharePoint to handle that. So now we're using approval, we're including our manager, right? We can see that process, we can see visibility into it, all these other benefits, right? And now, basically, we work on the news article, it gets approved, it's published, and everyone can see it. Well, now, our boss's boss comes to us and says, I want to know how much time you're spending building news articles. I want to understand, how frequently you're doing, is it different types of articles, how long do they take, all these other factors. Now, if I was back here in communication and all I was doing was uploading, so I had the creation date basically and the upload date, how effectively can I report on that? Not at all, really. And if I'm in the second level, I can start to get more because now I have version history, right? I see some of things, but that approval process, I have no visibility into how long that's truly taking, right? No tracking and other things. But finally, when I get all of those things, it's much easier to report on that, right? It's much easier to start to give that type of information. Now, this is a really simple example, but it's the idea that we build up to that. So if you have executives, you have these wonderful projects, and these, by the way, I'm not saying you can't start on the right, I'm just saying it's harder, right? So if you're going to do this, try and figure out a way to stage it where you're going through these sort of gates or you're following this process because from a user perspective, it's easier to capture it. And obviously, from an execution standpoint, it's much easier to plan for, right? You're iteratively building on what you've done before. All right. So let's say we do all this really effectively. Joe achieves momentum with those two groups, right? Those two groups are bought in. They understand the value of SharePoint, and we have a shared understanding of the value, which is a key concept. But we have to be really careful because expectations always increase over time. So if Joe doesn't communicate with them, or if I'm not communicating with Joe with them around where we are and where we are in that process and other things like that, often their expectations will be higher than where we're at. And it's really important to have that dialogue. And I don't mean just communicating, yes, we're behind. I'm saying why and how does it relate to the objectives we're trying to achieve, because the objectives are what they're going to understand, right? In this case, most of the business users, and even IT to a degree. All right. So determining and supporting ROI. Now, this is a really tricky subject, and I'm actually going to try and cover it in 5 minutes to 10 minutes, so it's going to be even harder, right? All right. So how do we get here? Well, first, there's this idea of discounted cash flow. So, we have $5 now is worth less, right, over time. And then there's this idea of if you're implementing SharePoint, you get your return over time. You guys want to talk about math? No? All right, whatever. What about real options analysis? So this is one of my favorite ones, right, because you have decision trees, and basically at this point, if we continue forward, this is the probable cost, and if we stop, this is what we're kind of our loss factor is, right? And no, okay, all right, that's all right. What about probability heuristics? These are really fun, right? So, it's basically 100,000 flips of the coin, and it's like how Monte Carlo analysis. This is exciting for me. I understand, it's been a long week. So instead of focusing on how to calculate these things, because you can learn that on your own, it's really easy. Just pick up a book. Instead, we're going to talk about different ways of using ROI versus calculating ROI. So I'm going to focus on using ROI. And in fact, I talked about an example of this in the strategy session I did earlier, right? Prioritization. We'll come back to that. And this is a really critical one, to improve return. That's what ROI is meant to do, right? Ignore everything else. At the end of the day, your goal with ROI is how do we prioritize things better, and then more importantly, perhaps, how do we improve the return that we're getting? So if we think about that, the simplest ROI formula ever, who knows this? Who was in the other session? Right? Even this two-dimensional character, Joe, can do this. Right? There we go. Estimated value divided by estimated difficulty, right? And if we take this formula one step further, it's really easy to do through an example. We have a relatively difficult thing, has okay return, right? It's good value. And then we have this other thing that's really easy, or relatively easy, and has okay return. Well, if we do this simple math, it's very, very clear which one we should do first, if there's no technical dependencies and yada, yada, right? So we know which one we should do first because we've done simple math. And this formula, estimated value to difficulty is driven typically by the technical teams that are executing this, right? They're telling you how difficult this will be. And typically the value is driven by the business, right? Or the stakeholders who understand what value this is going to provide. And sometimes they can give you numbers. Sometimes you can actually do very, very intricate math. Sometimes you can use some of those calculation formulas and methods that I was talking about earlier. And this can be really advanced. But even if it's not advanced, you can still do this at a minimum. The problem is, too often, people prioritize things by one or the other, but not by both. And that's a really big risk. So if you're taking one thing out of this, we need to consider both. Cool. All right. Let's move on to the other one, which is that ROI is meant to improve return. And traditionally, it measures numbers, dollars, right? But then there's all this other stuff. And there's lots of this other stuff that we have that we can measure, but it's not really clear how this has an impact on dollars and cents at the end of the day. Now, there's lots of methods to do that correlation. I'm just going to use one example. In fact, I tried to pick the hardest possible example to try and show how this kind of works. I chose to use blogs, which many people find not valuable and not to have ROI, a social feature of SharePoint that's often underused. And I'm going to talk about how you can measure some things about the blogs and you can return more value. So in this circumstance, this organization has been doing newsletters, it's been doing many other things, and they decide, you know what we're going to do? We're going to roll out leadership blogs. And the reason we want to do leadership blogging, they're not going to call it blogs because that has a whole lot of connotations. Instead, they'll call it leadership article engine or something, right? But the reality is they're releasing these articles in blog format because then there's going to be engagement, there's going to be potential communication, it's going to help reduce some of the costs and some of these things like the newsletters, it's going to be able to be measured a little bit better than some of these other methods that they're using and so on and so forth. So if you push an executive enough and you say, if you could communicate this message to 500 of our employees, how much value is that to you? And if you spend enough time with them, they will give you a number. You will actually be able to get a number. The further you get with this, the closer you're going to get to a number. And they'll say, you know what, it's roughly $5,000 worth of value every time a key message that I have gets out to 500 people in the organization, and they really read it. All right, so we decide we're going to implement these blogs. But what happens is, after we implemented these blogs, we find out no one's visiting them. They're not getting any visibility. What are we tracking? Usage statistics, right? We're seeing how many hits they have. And what we determine then is that there's this weird spike in one of these blogs. And the spike is because, when we asked the executive why, they said, I emailed everyone. I let them know that I created this new blog. So what does that tell us? It tells us there's an issue. The issue is awareness. People aren't aware that these new blogs are being put. So what do? We take very, very minor action. We add a content query web part or a content search web part on the home page. It renders up these recent blog articles. And now all of a sudden, we're seeing this type of hit. Right? This is real data, so that's holidays. So we see this type of hit, right, where we're getting hits and hits and hits. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us a couple things. The first one is $5,000, $5,000, $5,000 if it's a key point. The second thing it tells us is that this does matter to people. Some subject matter matters more. In fact, in one of the months, you can see we got a ton of return hits. People would come back to it again and again and again. Why do you think they were coming back to it? It was useful, right? It had graphs, it had information that they really wanted that helped them. So this gave something that's almost priceless to the executive, right? How do I improve my messaging? How do I change the way that I'm communicating? And the value of that is massive. Massive for the organization. So in this circumstance, it may not seem like that big of a deal initially, but over time, as we tweak things, as we measure things and we respond to them, we start to get more and more value from this. Make sense? It's a hard thing to kind of talk through. So we'll move on. There's also this danger of measuring too much or the wrong things. So in the end of World War II, there was a ton of Spitfires being made, right? So in England, they were making all these Spitfires. And you know what they did? They'd take these Spitfires, some of them would get shot down, and some of them would land on the tarmac. And when they landed on the tarmac, these engineers would run out with these giant sheets of white paper. They'd put them all across the plane, take charcoal, and they'd scribble like this really fast across the plane. And what they found were silhouettes, right? Silhouettes of the bullet holes. And they found that certain areas of the plane get shot more than others. They put these big lamps underneath them. They put them over, nothing fancy, right? And they see that certain areas, statistically, are getting shot much more than other areas. So what do? Armor those areas more. Now, if we're using more materials, we can make less planes, right, in wartime. We can't make as many. It takes more time. But these planes should be better, so that our statistic that we're looking for is if less get shot down, right, if less basically are losing, then this was the right decision. But if the same amount or more, then it's bad decision, right, because the same amount means we've created less. Make sense? Well, what they found was the same amount or more got shot down. Who knows why? Well, you say that guy had the right answer. Anyone have the wrong answer? No, I'm teasing. So the answer is, and he's right, that they measured the wrong thing. They measured the planes that landed safely, not the ones that got shot down. So if you think about it, right, the silhouettes of the bullet holes were actually showing the least vital areas of the plane, right, versus the most vital. So they're measuring the wrong types of planes. Or they were taking the data and they were making the wrong assumptions and analysis from it. All right, so that's a pretty significant example. But in our environments, this happens all the time. I've worked with one organization. They had over 30 metrics that they measured. Now, a metric is a bunch of measurements for projects. Every project had all these metrics. And I was like, there's no way all these are being used. I was being driven insane. And when I'm driven insane, that means I'm on a quest and I'm going to figure out a way to basically change this in the organization. So I wrote a bunch of reports and I said, look, this is what I'm seeing. This is my interviews with other people around this subject. And I don't think these are being used. So that went up the ladder. And eventually I got feedback. And they said, you know what we did? We looked at it. And most of these metrics never got to where they were meant to get to. And the second thing we realized is many of these metrics were really unnecessary. So they removed a bunch of those, and the savings from that was millions of dollars, much more than I ever, to be honest, did with SharePoint in that circumstance, right? So sometimes measuring the wrong thing can be very dangerous, or measuring too much. But the secret is, if we're measuring something and it's improving our return, then we should continue measuring it, right? If we're measuring something and it's really helping with prioritization, we should continue to measure it. If it's not doing either of those things, question it, maybe readjust. All right. Let's move on. So we measure. Pretty straightforward. Now there's this other thing, which is fear of bad estimation. People are like, if I give an estimate, right, I run into this all the time, I'm going to get in big trouble. So two things. One, always give an estimate in ranges. Never give a single value. It gives levels of confidence and communicates other things. The second thing to understand is that the more you estimate, the better you're going to get at estimating. You're going to calibrate. And an estimate, even a huge range, is better than nothing. Right? Vaguely right is better than precisely wrong. Make sense? So please start measuring stuff. Please start estimating, and so on and so forth. All right. So now we have this other thing called governance. Now, I did do a quick talk in the strategy session. I'm sure you've seen other governance sessions at the conference. What we're going to do is do this in a quick manner. So governance is required. I think everyone here can agree that there's a level of governance that's required. And the reason it's required is because we want to get more out of our environment, right? Without effective governance, organization performance and capability are significantly reduced. Well, what does that mean? It's basically like, and I've used this analogy before, it's like a football team that doesn't have roles and responsibilities in teams and structure. If the quarterback is sometimes playing the kicker position, sometimes in the linebacker position, how effective is that team going to be? Not very, right? So get more out of that team, we need to create roles and responsibilities. We need to find patterns and practices. All right, so how does this translate to SharePoint? Well, we have teams. Right? We need to create specific teams. And the teams we create are a business strategy team. You can call it whatever you want. Business committee, I don't care. But the key point here is they're defining the business objectives. And they're doing it in a way where they're prioritizing the business objectives and communicating why these objectives are valuable. And they're specific. They're not platitudes. They're very specific objectives. We went through an example earlier with HR, right? And then the second thing is you have this team that says, OK, thank you for those objectives. Here's how we're going to achieve them. That's really all the initiative or technical strategy or whatever you want to call it. That's all that team's doing. They're saying, here's how we're going to achieve these objectives. We're going to do it with these solutions, with these technologies, and so on and so forth. Right? And they're communicating how difficult it is back to the business. Together, they're coming up with the right priorities. They're figuring out what staffing they need, and so on and so forth. All right. Then there's these tactical teams. And one of the key points I'm going to make here, for those who are using Office 365, you may look at this and go, you know what? We don't even need the operations team. Wrong. Right? There's lots of specific things you still need to do on an operational side, even if you're using cloud infrastructure. So it's really important to understand you need to have patterns and practices around these three core areas: infrastructure or operations, if you will, development, and support. So we'll go through some examples of that in a second. I'm going to highlight one more thing, which is that if it's not a pattern, who cares? If you're going through governance and you're saying, we've got this one-off situation and you're not sure if it's ever going to happen again, until it happens again, don't start figuring out every policy and every situation for it, unless it's very disruptive or costly, right? So risks and other insurance type factors, fine, deal with it then. But for the majority of things, it's when you have a frequent process or a frequent problem that you want to respond to it with policies or guidance or other things, right? So that's also important. All right, thank you, Joe. So executing governance, right, is kind of like plays. Right? If we have site provisioning, a site provisioning process is like a play. And you can see this. There's this noticeable difference when you go to an organization that has good governance and an organization that doesn't have good governance. You take something very simple like site provisioning, and an organization that has at least some levels of governance, they're going to typically have a process. Right? They're going to have a form. They're going to have something where basically it goes through this process of review from different parties and other people in the organization, and then there's value delivered at the end of that, which is in many cases a site or a site in training or a site in other things. All right. So this is what everyone cares about. The artifacts, the deliverables, the documents, right, that come from governance. Yeah. Right? So first, the idea of a governance plan, not planning, a governance plan as an individual document is the stupidest idea ever. Period. It should never be a single document. It's a stupid idea. Governance has so many outcomes. I'll talk about them in a second. There's so many outcomes, so much degrees of ownership where this person owns that person owns that. They're all being updated on different frequencies. The idea of putting it in a single document is a terrible idea because it's not manageable. Now, I'm not saying don't create an aggregate or a reference document that contains references to all sorts of other policies and guidance and material, but certainly don't try and put it all into this unmanageable single document. And if you have that, then that means you haven't really matured in your governance and you've really probably taken some from TechNet or something like that. All right. So objectives and priorities. Another thing that we're going to come up with is tactical benefits. Now, I'm going to skip over these. Remember, the slides are available to you. But there's lots of specific things we're going to come up with, policies and plans for all these different factors. And some of these, like I said, are very true still in Office 365. Even disaster recovery. You're like, what? Why would we need to plan for disaster recovery for using Office 365? Well, there's lots of circumstances. Even think of the item level, right? If I want to restore an item from the recycling bin in Office 365, who does that? What's the SLA time on that? How do we define ownership and other responsibilities for that? And how are we executing that? And so on and so forth, right? So there's always a need there. And there's an example link there that shows you much more in terms of samples. Development, there's lots of things. Standards are required. You may say, we don't even have a development team. Why do we need these documents? Why do we even need to think about these considerations? Well, if you are working with developers, if you have external people working in your environment, or if you have people using SharePoint Designer, you have a level of development. So it's really important to understand there's still patterns and practices. There's still things that you can communicate and guidance and improvements that you can make by spending a little bit of time and effort in this area, right? And hopefully on a regular basis. This often becomes a community rather than a team. It might have like a core structure. Anyways, we'll move on. All right. There's support outcomes, right? So there's lots of support documents that typically come out of that. Lots and lots and lots of support documents. And I can go on and on about all these. The key is, these don't matter. The process of meeting, the process of having these people who have a shared interest and giving them the opportunity to say, how can we improve, is more important than the outcomes. Because if you put a bunch of operational people in a room, let's say, and you say, how do we improve? They'll come up with the disaster recovery plans. They'll come up with maintenance and monitoring plans. It's their nature, right? It's the nature of the work that we do. All right. So with governance, it's kind of like a football team, right? With good plays and processes and stuff like that. All right. There's a key point here, which is that everyone needs to achieve a shared understanding of SharePoint-based objectives and processes, right? A lot of people want to boil the ocean. They're like, oh, let's do SharePoint governance. Oh, you know what? Let's do ITIL. Let's do like this huge governance framework and figure out how it's going to work with everything. We're going to do information governance, and information governance is going to stretch across all of our different applications, from email to everything else. So I'm saying, fine, but hey, you know what? I just care about SharePoint. It's biased. Granted, I work in a SharePoint consulting company, but at the end of the day, try and get one of them right? If you're going to do it, try and finish up SharePoint, figure out those policies and processes, and then tackle those other ones. Or tackle them as different thoughts, right? Don't try and put it all together. And then at the end, I know it feels like you're going to be siloed. You're not, because people natively understand in their roles what they're doing and how that works with everything. All right. Another big thing, right? Again, too much focus on the documents. Who cares? The documents are less important than the process. And never, ever ask a consultant or somebody else externally to give you those documents. You should be creating them yourself. Now, they can give you samples. They can help you with that. They can encourage you and coach you. But the reality is you have to create this yourself. All right. So the next one is supporting and approaching SharePoint. And this is a challenge. What's the best approach for implementing SharePoint or SharePoint-based solutions? It's really the same. Waterfall? Really, really long processes of getting requirements and then building it? No, right? The reality is an iterative approach is the right approach. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. SharePoint's huge, right? We already talked about all the versions and additions and other things. It's a massive, massive platform in terms of its capabilities. So learning it takes forever. And when a person tells you the requirements, everyone here who's a business analyst knows that they don't really know what they want. Right? They kind of tell you, and then you kind of build something for them, and you show them, and they're like, that's not really what I wanted. And then you kind of tweak it, and you do it again, and you do this up and down process where you're kind of going through the phases of understanding it, and then planning it, and then building it, prototyping it as an example, and then you keep going back, right? And if this is working well, we're doing lots of iterations, and we're being very rapid. So SharePoint's benefit is that you can build very rapid solutions. The difficult part is understanding that that might not be familiar for your environment. That might not even be familiar with IT, and that certainly might not be structured in a way with your chargeback models, your project management processes, and other things that's going to work well with it. So you really have to think about that. But this is the right approach for SharePoint. I think we can all agree on that. All right. So then there's the support planning. And support with SharePoint is tricky for two reasons, right? SharePoint's difficult. If you're an end user, close your eyes for a moment and imagine this situation. You're sitting there at your desk. You go to grab a document from the desk. You can see it. It's right there. And then SharePoint slaps your hand and says, sorry, that's checked out by Doug. Right? You can't work on that right now. So SharePoint can be very disruptive for a lot of people when they're new. And this is I'm talking about document management. It's not really SharePoint, right? But these types of new processes or new behaviors that SharePoint introduces, and they're good behaviors, right? They can be very disruptive. So we have to think about that. SharePoint can be intrusive. Right? It can be really kind of annoying and intrusive, right? So we have to understand that SharePoint can be intrusive and it can be disruptive, right? It can be challenging. So if it's those two things, what does that mean? It means we need to think of support. We need to think of training. We need to think of how we're going to engage users. You cannot ignore this. All right, that makes sense. Let's move on. Don't forget you're not Superman. How many people are Superman? You're in your organization, you are the everything. You're doing IT Pro, you're doing dev, you're doing, working with users. Lots of us, right? The reality is, even if you're Superman, you're not alone. You need to leverage other people in the organization. I've been there. I've done it too. You have to leverage other people because you will not be able to keep up alone. So we want to leverage other people. We want to figure out ways of providing self-help and resources so people can learn on their own. And then we want to provide ways where users can work with each other. We want to provide resources. Some of the best things I ever did when I was working in an organization internally and working with lots of departments, what I did is I would buy books out of my own money. I would go and buy an InfoPath book, and I would give it to the guy who said, I really want to understand like this InfoPath thing and I want to build it. I'm like, great, here. Just read this book, try it. Here's an environment, here's a site, go do your own thing. And what happens is you get these champions over time that really do make your job much easier. And then, of course, we have site administrators, which may be a different quality of person, right? So someone who's a little bit more technically apt, or that they have requirements to do these types of tasks. And we have help desk. Help desk is really important to train. Yeah, I have time for a quick story. So one organization, we just finished a governance meeting. I was walking out the door, and as I'm walking out, we're walking past the support help desk. And I overheard this conversation. And I was talking, but it's hard to not overhear. And the individual was talking about a very common problem in SharePoint. So in SharePoint, sometimes you get this login prompting, right? And it's often because of a trusted intranet zone, not trusted site, trusted intranet zone setting inside of IE, right? Basically says, okay, this is trusted, you can pass this login authentication over. So it's a very simple fix, right? They basically had to change this IE setting or apply a group policy, so on and so forth. But this individual said format your computer. That's not the right answer. But so here's what's crazy though. If that individual had formatted their computer, it would have resolved the issue. Why? Because that individual wasn't on site. If they had formatted the computer, they would have had to bring it back. The group policy, which was enacted, would have been applied, which it hadn't been applied, and now everything would be hunky-dory, right? So in a magical world, if no one had introduced or intervened, this person might have actually thought in help desk that the right solution for a very common problem was to format your computer. And so all I'm saying is make sure that help desk understands the training. And if help desk isn't doing the sort of support, if they're not doing the requests and handling those calls, then at least help them understand how to catalog them, how to categorize them, right? How to know when it's a SharePoint issue versus an Office issue versus an Internet Explorer issue or a different browser issue, right? And I gave an example the other day where we talked about the importance of measuring support and saying, instead of calling everything SharePoint, this is a SharePoint ticket, we want to call it SharePoint permission ticket, SharePoint this ticket, SharePoint that ticket, right? We need to clearly identify what the problem is, and we want to categorize it so that over time we can start to introduce new training and other things and new support arrangements and see if that has a positive impact on reducing those numbers of tickets or making the cycle time for those tickets much quicker. Make sense? Cool. Diversify support. Too many organizations, they have one model of support, which is help desk, and they don't really do anything else. It's super easy to do this. In fact, I'll show you an example in a little bit of some resources that are available to you. Avoid too much too fast. You know, when I was first learning to drive a car, I had a Suzuki Sidekick, and my dad was in the car with me. It was a standard car. And as I'm driving the car, all you hear is this like, right, as you're driving. And then my dad's got this face like, and he's a big man. He's a very intimidating man, right, sitting beside me. And so I remember that expression on my face when I held that stick shift, just, right? And that expression I see sometimes when I put SharePoint in front of a user, they grab the mouse, and I see that same startled expression, right? It's a very scary thing. So make sure you're taking it easy, right? Find the right approach so that it works for everyone. And of course, that means you're going to have different levels of training. Right? There's going to be stuff for advanced, and there's going to be stuff for simple and basic. Do not ignore the basic stuff. A lot of organizations go, we'll deal with the advanced stuff. Don't. A lot of the very basic stuff is important. All right. And of course, branding and other things can support that. Microsoft is awesome. I'm very subtle, if you haven't noticed that. Microsoft is awesome, so you should use them. How many people here have used Productivity Hub? Awesome. This is like the biggest audience that has ever put a lot of hands up. So this is a great little resource that Microsoft has done. They do, I think it was supposed to be monthly updates. So anyways, quarterly updates at a minimum. So they're giving these updates of all these training resources and other material to your organization. You can manage it. You can decide what training you want to be available, what you don't want available. You can put your own training, like BlackBerry training or iPad training or whatever you want inside of the same environment. It's a site collection, right? It introduces features that are very smart, right? So if you've never even done this, you might find that some of the little features, like the way they highlight things or the way they do spotlighted resources and training, featured videos, things like that, could be very helpful for your organization. So even if it's not that you're going to use this, but you want to use it as idea generation or to put it in front of stakeholders and talk about it, it's a great talking point. So please take a look at this. It's pretty easy to find, SharePoint Productivity Hub. All right, support tip, biggest support tip of all time, respond. Right? It's a 911 call. When the user says, I have a SharePoint issue, it's like a 911 call. You need to be able to respond to it. So what does that mean? We need to have staffing. We need to have all these processes. We need to have the efficiency to be able to respond. All right. Makes sense. Let's move on. So in a magical world, if we've planned for all these support things, we've got the budget, we've got the resourcing and everything else, we have pretty significant and effective support for SharePoint. And I have seen many organizations that do a good job of this. But the key here is that a lot of people underestimate this cost. In fact, I would say this is probably the most underestimated cost of SharePoint. And I'm not saying training is. I'm saying, in general, engaging users, helping them understand the platform, and understanding how to deal with some of the exceptions and other challenges is the most costly area. All right, let's move on. We're going to speed up a little bit. Improving user adoption. Very fun topic, right? How do we get successful adoption? Basically, people need to understand the value. In other words, I've got this thing in front of me. I don't really know what it does. But then, if I understand what it does and I understand how it's providing value to me, I'm happy. I don't care what the thing is. I just want to know that it's helping me. Right? Make sense? So what we want to do is we want to communicate in lots of different ways how it's helping people. And you could go, well, if we have it always available, that helps, right? Stability. Another one is if you can access it externally, maybe if you can access it from mobile devices or alternative devices, maybe if you have actual accessibility too, which is like a separate thing where, SharePoint font is really small. You notice that? It's like really tiny, especially in 2010. You're kind of 2007, you're looking, and it's really hard to see. So there's lots of ways we can improve that. And of course, there's more and more and more. So let's move on. Another one. This sucks. This is 2007. It's ugly. I mean, it's whatever. Let's face it. At the time, it was cool. It sucks now. Let's move on. That's true. 2010. It's better, right? In many cases, the out-of-the-box, it's pretty straightforward. The ribbon might be familiar to users. So there's some nice things here. But it still sucks at some other things. So, I think in general, the idea of documents, lists, right? Document libraries, a lot of these terms are very confusing to users. What does that mean, right? So let's move on. 2013, right? Better, because it's a little bit easier to understand. Apps, people will get it eventually, right? But there's more challenges here. So I'm going to tell you two things. I'm going to make this simpler. There's lots we could talk about around identity brand, making it simpler to understand and use. First one is consistency across environments. Themes are awesome, right? They're really cool and powerful in the new platform, and they were actually available in all the other platforms. The reality is they can be very confusing to users. It's weird, but a user who goes from a green environment to a red environment may not even know that that's the same system. They honestly get confused. So you have to be very smart about how you're doing that. If you have the quick launch here, and then you go to another site and the quick launch is not there, it's very confusing if people are used to using that quick launch format. That's the left-hand navigation, right? Another big one, this drives me insane. If I go into environments 2 years from now, any of your environments, and I see this on all your sites, I'm going to be upset. It even says delete me remove this, right? When you're done. When you're done getting started, remove it. Well, if you're provisioning a site for a user and you're going through a process with them that's engaged, there better not be this when you're done. Because it should say, hey, by the way, we have some libraries here. This is the description of the libraries. Here's a link to it. Here's how this works. Here's some training videos, whatever. Anything that can help them, right? So that when you see an environment with maturity, they don't have a lot of these. I'm not saying you might have some of them in the collaboration-based sites that are kind of deleted over time or whatever. I don't care about that. I'm just saying in general. I've seen too many department sites, even in the internet that have these types of things showing up. All right, let's move on. Make it fun. Now, I don't like this, not because I don't like fun, but it's really to get attention. So this can be really beneficial to get attention, scavenger hunts, contests, things like that. Some of the contests can even have goals, like profile fill rate. So we need to fill out user profiles. So one organization basically said, what we're going to do is we're going to do a charity donation. For every single profile you fill out, we're going to donate $1 in a large company. And then each department, right, if you fill out more profiles, you get to pick which charity gets the donation. There's really interesting things that people have done. There's lots of examples. Again, the link's there that shows you over 50 of them. There's lots of examples that people have done for this. But the key factor is to understand a difference between adoption and engagement and over time sustaining that versus just kind of getting an interest. So if your profile fill rate is your goal, that's great. But if you want it to be maintained over time, that might not be the right approach. You might need to do some additional work on that. Rewarding people helps. Saying thank you. Saying thank you goes a long way, right? And giving people other techniques like badges and rewards and other things can also go a long way. Creating a SharePoint showcase. This is a really simple idea, right? You have a user or a group, you've engaged with them, you've built something cool, vacation scheduling, I don't care, some simple solution. It may even use all out-of-the-box features. You take some screenshots of it, you do a very, very brief write-up that says this is why it's awesome. You put the contact information of the user or group or department that you worked with, not IT, as the primary contact on it. What happens is that user or that group that is interested in this talks to them, goes, how do you build it? How is this working for you? Then they go to IT or whatever, or they do it on their own in some cases. They build these. And then when this one comes up with new ideas of how to improve it, they decide they want to add color coding, as an example, to the vacation, to the vacation scheduling calendar. Then what ends up happening is they share that with IT. IT shares that with the other departments or groups that are using this solution. right? Using something that's taken from the showcase. It's like marketing and products, right? We basically have a catalog of all the stuff that we offer. This is a really powerful thing if you can start building it over time. And the simplest ones are often the ones that are most used, right? Team sites should be obvious, but a lot of people don't understand the value of a team site. If you come up with some simple pictures and explanations that make sense in the context of one department, it probably makes sense in the context of another or another location. All right. Really, really simple example. The hyperlink column, that's a list column in SharePoint, sucks, right? I said that a lot. I keep saying that word. But HTTP, this, put all my information in. No user, very few users understand the idea of copying shortcuts, copying the URL, and pasting it into this thing. Well, there's actually, since 2007, there's been another column in publishing, so you have to have standard or above. There's another column called, let me get the hyperlink with formatting and constraints for publishing. Right? So what that column is a site column. So it doesn't appear when you go to create list columns. You have to create it as a site column. But that column, you click Browse, and it's a Browse dialog. It's really easy and intuitive. So why the heck are we using the hyperlink column when we have this column that's better? So sometimes it's not even this big thing. It's not this strategy and rolling out initiatives and campaigns. Sometimes it's just saying, you know what? SharePoint's annoying to work with. Let's just make it a little bit easier by using it right. All right. SharePoint successfully adopted by a large enough number of people. Key, not everyone, just a large enough that it sustains itself and it's deemed successful. You will not be able to get the right level of adoption for your organization, and the right level is different for every organization, without putting some energy and thought into this. All right. Last section, and then we're going to do a quick summary. Planning for new work and growth. Exciting topic, right? This is what we want. We want this problem. We want to not have enough SharePoint resources in our firm, but we want to have that for the right reasons. We want to know we have too many projects, we have too many potential scenarios where we can deliver benefit and value to the business, we have proven success record, and we want to have all these open recs because we want to get those types of resources in to build the business. The downside is when you have this problem, but it's because you didn't build a channel, you don't understand the objectives and the value and the other things you're providing, and you're not able to showcase it, so you can't get those resources. You can't even get the budget for those resources or the appropriate salaries and other things, and so you're drowning, right, in this. Make sense? So basically, in other words, you've got to know your limits. And this is a challenging thing with SharePoint because you need to understand how it's being used in your organization. What are we using it for now? What are we using it for in the future? If you can't answer those two questions, it's impossible to know your limits, and you're going to get burned, unfortunately, like Joe is here. But Joe's got some friends, right? He's got people like us, and he works together with other people outside of his organization and many people that they bring in the organization over time that help solve this problem. And the key here is it's not an everything SharePoint person. They have very specific roles and skill sets. And you should be hiring for these. I know I harped about this in the other session, but it's really important that you're not trying to find an everything SharePoint person. If you have open recs and it says they need to be able to do business analysis, they need to be able to do IT pro stuff, they need to be able to develop, they need to do this, you have a very poorly written rec. Because those people that will take that job, we'll hire them first. And we'll pay more because we're going to work with all of you guys and sell them basically back to you as consultants. I mean, being honest, right? So you have to make sure that you're being specific. In many cases, you may be able to use existing resources and leverage it a little bit better, right? That idea of using a lot of end users and using a lot of people that have technical specialties and expertise. Some person that works with .NET, they can maybe move into the SharePoint development position a little bit easier, right? Somebody who does HTML and other stuff, if you're on 2013, they can do tons of stuff. Right? They don't even need to use necessarily a full underpinning of knowledge on the SharePoint platform. So there's lots of other factors here to consider. All right. The idea here is cultivating new work is a good thing, right? We want more new work. It shows, over time, more dependency, more uses. That's a good sign. That's success, right, in my book. All right. So SharePoint implementation continues to grow. If you don't see growth and you see the opposite, then that's a very, very unhealthy sign. The second thing is that if you're not seeing very clearly, and this can be two things. It could be anecdotal evidence, right, where someone's like, hey, we just got value out of SharePoint in these 3 ways, and it's a nice little story. And Susan Hanley, who's at the conference, has wonderful material on this idea of serious anecdotes, and it's a great method. Or it could be actual numbers. We had this project, this was the budget, this was the return. We had this business process, this is how we improved it, right? This is the number of people that were using it, this is the frequency it was being used for, and so on and so forth. We get our baseline, and then from there we have our improvement. Right? So as long as you can communicate that and you're seeing that, those are positive signs. All right. You need to plan for this. You need to plan for how you're going to deal with new projects and new work and new growth. And it is a little bit different for SharePoint than it is with ERP and other systems, because typically a lot of those other scenarios and solutions are run organization-wide, and they go through a longer cycle. With these types of solutions, because they're so iterative, and there's an expectation, because everyone who's worked at another organization knows that they can get these solutions quickly. So there's an expectation that IT has to be able to deliver these solutions much more rapidly than historically maybe some other technologies have. All right. So let's review that, because I know that's a lot, right? And I talked really fast. So let's go back through that. One, making the right technology decisions. The way we do this is we understand the business needs and we map to them. Pretty straightforward, right? Straightforward, but difficult, because we need to understand the ecosystem. We need to understand Microsoft's ecosystem. We need to understand the partner ecosystem. Right? We need to understand those additions and other things of SharePoint. All right. Achieving buy-in and setting expectations. How do we do that? We share alignment, right? That chart that we showed earlier with direct relationship or direct benefit and indirect benefit, that's sharing alignment. We're saying these solutions we're building will have a positive impact, or an impact, hopefully a positive one, on achieving these objectives. Right? That's one way of sharing alignment. There's lots of other methods for that. And we have to share expectations, because expectations with SharePoint can be a killer. ROI, really, really easy. Measure and improve to return more. Yes, it can be used for prioritization, but the thing that I really want to harp on today is using it to return more value over time. So that's why it's worthwhile doing the baselines. That's why it's worth the time and effort to do little surveys and say, like, how are you working now? And then thinking of how you can work better and measuring. Did that, whatever we did, whatever these solutions and initiatives that are executed, did they have a positive impact on that? Implementing successful governance is really easy. It's teamwork and executing with patterns. That's really all it's about. If you have the teams, you have that basic dynamic of people working together, and you have patterns and practices and other things, everything else will come natively from it. You'll get guidance, you'll get policies. Right? I'm going to make one quick note. The idea of a scale, how many people have heard of or seen a picture where it's sort of like Wild West and sort of draconian IT control over on this side, right? Similar models. The only time you use a scale like that is for a binary decision. It's this or this. Because it's very misleading when you have a scale like that, because it feels like, oh, maybe we're somewhere in the middle. The reality is governance is different for each initiative. Think of it as a matrix, right? Sometimes we impose governance. Sometimes we empower governance. Sometimes we empower governance at a collective or group level, right? Sometimes, or organizational level. Sometimes we empower governance at an individual level. Sometimes we do imposing governance, like policies, right? Things like that. And we do that at a collective level, or we do it at an individual level. Right? So think of that matrix instead. This is a quick digression, but I think it's important. All right. So approaching and supporting SharePoint, the secret to this is actually really easy. Be iterative. Iteration is really key, because you can't support things if you're not being iterative, because you can't understand it, right? It takes time. And then leverage others and respond. Respond, respond, respond. If you're not able to respond, there's something wrong. And respond can be in a lot of different ways, as we've talked about. Improving user adoption. You share the value in the successes. You say, this is what was valuable. This was a success. You celebrate your wins. When that user comes to you and says, I built this wonderful SharePoint solution, you say, thank you. Thank you for building this solution. You don't go, right? So we may do that internally, but we say thank you, and then we try and encourage them and do more with it. Planning for new work and growth, really straightforward, right? If we understand, if we get everything else here, this is really easy. Right? At this point, all we're doing is managing our capabilities and priorities. All right. So hopefully that made sense. We have about 7 minutes before the end. So first, I'll give you guys a chance to clap if you want to. Thank you. There are resources up here. We do have a contest on if you want a Surface. I want one. So if you all don't apply to it, that means I might have a chance. So, please take a look at that. And come up to if you feel brave enough, come up to the mics. If you don't, just shout it out or put up your hand. I prefer that. And I'll repeat your questions just so we are all on the same page. You guys ready for questions? All right. Questions? No questions? Cool. All right. No hands? Really?
Are we on? There we go.
Time to breathe? Oh, yeah.
So in an effort to balance governance and not get too draconian these things, but also maintain usability and consistency within the sites.
Yep.
What's your opinion when it comes to governance implementing standards for how sites should be used. So we don't have folks using hot pink or this font and that font, and really stripping down what site owners can actually do from an editing standpoint.
That's I'm going to repeat it because it is kind of quiet even with those mics. So the question is, it is a tricky thing. How do we basically implement governance, right? And a true like how-to at a tactical level, right? So we have some things that are guidance, like we illustrated, some things that are policies. Which ones do you do? How do you do them? How do you prioritize which ones to tackle? And when you do them, how do you like check, is this really working? So there's a couple things. One, working with other organizations really helps. So if you can see what somebody else has done and you can reuse that, that has a lot of value. So the basic ones are like the things that are in the deck, right? So site provisioning, understanding how, site classifications, so types of sites, and figuring out that different types of sites have different business value and purposes, and then coming up with different models for that. So example, if I have a community site, in the new model or an existing one with NewsGator and other things like that, if I have a community site and I'm a Harley-Davidson company and we want to talk about Harley-Davidsons, the last thing I want to do is impose a structure that says every single entry in this community site must have this, like these 28 pieces of metadata, right, to be successful. Instead, I'm saying, here's guidance, here's seeded content, here's examples of how to make this work. Right? And so when you give that guidance, that has a much stronger value return, right? And it's much easier. On the opposite side, if I have something like a project site and I'm trying to use SharePoint for project management, I do have to create policies. I have to create rules that say how are we disposing of these because we want search to work, right, over time, and we'll run into issues with that for permissions and control. So you can define policies for that organizational area of project management, let's say, that make sense for that. So, site disposition, every project site needs to be identified with an owner and a secondary owner. They need to be reviewed on this basis so that we know whether or not basically to dispose of them, archive them, and so on and so forth. So those are specific examples. These examples that I'm providing that are group level or collective level, these are examples that are focused on content, right? So we're talking about information governance or content governance or whatever phrasing you want to use. There's technology governance. The technology governance is the easiest area to start. Now, there's a lot of opinions on this in terms of where to start in terms of importance. So certainly information and business governance is important, but at a personal level, I think the technology governance is the easiest thing to start with, and it's the easiest thing to get to a level of capability and confidence because Microsoft provides a massive amount of guidance on how to manage SharePoint, how to work with it from a product line architecture perspective on the new stuff, and even from the historic stuff. If you just look at TechNet for best practices or the community, you'll find the right way of sort of orchestrating, managing, maintaining, monitoring, and everything else for SharePoint. So the technical can be a little bit easier. The business, it's always an it depends, but the right way of thinking about it is exactly what you're doing, which is which policies might make sense, trying them out. If they don't work, get rid of them, right? Don't feel like you have to be tied to this process or policy. If you start it and it doesn't look like it's working, pull it back, take another attempt at it later, right? And do things like that. You have to have the support of business to do that, right? Stakeholders and other people. More questions? Yep, what's your question? Sure.
I just wanted to know your opinion about the value of an average employee trying to put any metadata or get content, but there doesn't seem to be any information.
So the question, it's a good one, is that it's difficult to get information on this, and at this conference there hasn't been a lot of talk about taxonomy and basically understanding how and when to use metadata and things like that, right? And so there's a lot of material out there, first of all, external to this conference, on metadata. I'm sure there were sessions that kind of talked about it, but probably not to the same level of depth because we're pretty technology focused at the conference. So your second piece to that was at an individual user level and things like that, is it that you want to encourage them to use that? Is that like you're asking? Right, okay, so how do we show the value? So 3 things. One, a gentleman by the name of Reuven Gotts is one of my favorite people for this, and he's a good friend of mine. So Reuven has a process that I totally agree with and that I use, which is when you're introducing the concept of metadata to a user, don't show them SharePoint, right? Now you can use analogies, right? The albums and managing your albums at home and whatever. So you can use lots of analogies to make the user understand the basics of what metadata does, right? That it gives you identification information about that document or attributes and so on and so forth, or data about data. But the second step is to actually make it familiar to them in the context of what they work. So if I'm a user and I have this file share directory and I'm happy and I think it's great, the reality is you can show them very quickly, if I want to find X number of documents by this, right? A lot of times when you try and do reports where you want to gather types of documents or a collection of documents, it falls apart very quickly, right? Because everything's stored in disconnected areas, there's siloed, there's duplicates. And so if you said instead, let's imagine I have an Excel document. And in this Excel document, I have all those same documents. The difference is instead of that nested structure, we just have these columns that have the exact same values, right, that we could artificially pull out, let's say, in a magic world. People understand that natively. They look at Excel, they go, oh, I get it, I can filter this column. Or I can click on, equivalent of a view, right, a collection of a report on this, and it filters a bunch of columns, and it shows me what I want. So people get Excel, and then at that point, typically what they say is, can you make this happen? I would love to have this in my file share or whatever, in my SharePoint site. And you say, yeah, absolutely. The way we do it is we use default values, right? We use folder default values, we use content types, we use all this other stuff. And you don't need to introduce them to all those capabilities and functionality. You're just really saying, and here's what it means. With this, the effort you need to do is you need to fill out maybe one field. Hopefully it's only one. Even if you have like 6, the other ones hopefully are done by default, or there's dependencies and other things. The more easy you can make it, obviously, the better. But in that circumstance, you're saying the value is you can see it like this in this Excel-like view, but you need to fill out this one field. And then most of the time when you get to that point of understanding, you've coached them, it's fine. It's when you don't have that level of engagement, that coaching, you're never going to get that level of response because they don't understand the value that that metadata is providing. And if they don't understand the value, they're not going to fill it out. And if they do fill it out, they'll pick the first value, right, if it's required. All right. More questions? That was a great one. I'm out of time anyways. All right. Thank you, everyone.